Hi, it's Mr. Norton with another video here for Advanced Placement European History. In our previous video, we focused mainly on Luther and basically the rise of Lutheranism and basically all the events that led to him separating from the Catholic Church and starting his movement. We're going to finish off with basically the life of Luther, not necessarily the end of our discussion on Lutheranism, but we're also going to focus on another Protestant Reformation religion known as Calvinism in our lecture today. Let's go ahead and get started. It's just kind of some recap. In our last lecture, we had talked about how Luther was brought before the Reichstag, and basically he was put in a situation where he was trying to be forced to recant the things that he had said against the Catholic Church. We had Emperor Charles V, brand new emperor for the Holy Roman Empire, who was really like, he was like, I guess you could say he was like a super Catholic. Really wanted to make sure all of his people were being brought to Catholicism. We'll learn later that it doesn't really work out for him. So he's really super into trying to get Luther to take back the things that he had said. He refuses to, though, and basically Luther's considered an outlaw. Luther's supposed to be brought before Charles V to basically receive punishment. But fortunately for Luther, he's able to hide with the help of the ruler of the German Principality of Saxony. While he's hiding, he translates the Bible to German. So that's where we were at in our last one. So one of the nice things about the Bible being able to be read in German is that now everybody can basically read it in vernacular. But there's a problem, though, is that Germany, it's still pretty highly illiterate. You only have 5% of the people who can read. So how does this really help as far as the spread of Lutheranism? Well, of course, you're going to be able to have the elites, the rich, the very powerful, the very educated, be able to read and be influenced by this new translation of the Bible. So how do we go ahead and spread the word of Lutheranism for those who can't read? Well, that's going to be done through sermon. You also have all these debates that get spread around Germany, and so basically you have these pro-Lutheran people debating against Catholics, and you end up finding that most people believe that in most cases that it's the Lutheran debaters that are winning these debates. Luther also relied heavily on music to try and help spread his message too. So again, we don't have people who can read, and these are the people you're trying to reach, so you have to find ways to do this. So through sermon. Now keep in mind, sermon's in vernacular, it's not in Latin, so this helps too. Remember that prior to this time, everything was done in Latin, and even if you went to the sermon, you didn't even know what was being said for the most part. So, alright. So things that help spread Luther's ideas, well, you have secular leaders and you have church leaders all join. About 3/4 of the early converts were actually high church officials, and that really helps because those are people who are able to work with the leaders within these local states to help try and make transformations and get away from Catholicism. Okay. Some problems for Luther, though. No movement really ever has a problem-free transition. So you have problems within his own movement where you have some who want to get rid of certain aspects of the religion that he's trying to move. Some are trying to basically get rid of the Mass. Some are trying to get rid of relics in general. You have Christian humanists, as we've talked way back in our first lecture in the Protestant Reformation movement. They start to turn their back on him because they had supported him at first because they wanted to see changes within the Catholic Church too. But what they're seeing with Lutheranism now is basically he's trying to smash Catholicism and create something new, and that's not something that they want. So when we talked about Erasmus before, Erasmus doesn't want Catholicism to be eliminated. He just wants changes to be made to it. We also have a problem with the Peasants' War. Basically what happens is the causes of the Peasants' War is that you have the lower realms of the socioeconomic status people, socioeconomic classes within Germany. There is economic recovery going on, and they're not really feeling it. They're not benefiting from it. It doesn't help them either, the fact that the nobles are abusing them in terms of placing new taxes on them. So basically they're pretty angry, and they take it out on them. So one of the things they also believe is that Luther is going to support their cause. Unfortunately for them, he doesn't. So Luther's reaction, basically, he's trying to say that nobles were given the grace of... basically, they've been appointed to rule and keep the peace. He does this in a writing called Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. He basically greenlights the nobility to go ahead and use violence to put them down. The peasants do end up getting some support from the Lutheran movement, but not from Luther himself. Obviously, it's from Münster, one of his former followers, but it doesn't really go anywhere for them because you have to keep in mind it's basically the super rich versus the super poor trying to fight each other. And in the end, even though the peasants may have had early success, it ends up being the nobles who end up winning. Now, Luther doesn't basically just leave the nobility blameless. He does say, hey, you need to treat your people better, and this should have never happened. You should be more responsible. But you have to keep in mind, too, that Luther may have a conflict of interest here. He's trying to make sure that his movement is spreading. He solely relies upon the nobility and other leaders within the local governments to make sure that this happens. So if he relies on the people who are basically doomed to lose, because in most cases that you ever look at, the peasants, no matter how many times they try and start up some ruckus, always get shut down in the end. So whether that really is some conflict of interest, I always like to think it is. You may think differently. Other historians may think differently. That's okay too. Now when we talk about organizing the Lutheran Church, justification in faith alone is the primary belief. Remember, that's the idea that you can only go to heaven through faith. Good deeds are not going to be what gets you into heaven. The Catholic Church had 7 sacraments. It still has 7 sacraments. And Luther only keeps 2, and those are going to be communion and baptism. He does not believe in transubstantiation. Basically, that has to do with a ritual with communion. Okay. Basically, that is the belief that so when you take communion, I don't know how many of you have done that. Basically, they talk about the body and the blood of Christ. He does not believe that that's the body and blood of Christ. That's just supposed to be the spirit of, like, the spirit is within those things. It doesn't actually turn into the body and blood of Christ. And we'll see the same thing carry over when we talk about Calvinism too. He doesn't want a church hierarchy. And the problem with that is he doesn't get his reality here, because what ends up happening is the local rulers end up setting up governing bodies anyways. They end up creating little organizations too that end up serving as supervisors and punishing church members too. Remember, Luther didn't want any hierarchy because he thought everybody could be their own supervisor. Like the person who should be interpreting and being the church leaders, interpreting the Bible and being the church leaders, are just people themselves. Everybody could be their own priest. He does have service. The service basically is a combination of vernacular liturgy and song. So if you don't know what that means, the liturgy is just basically the lesson, the teaching, and of course songs. But that shouldn't be any surprise either. As we mentioned earlier, you have a bunch of people who are illiterate who are supposed to be getting taught church and religion, and, well, you can't do that if you're just going to have them read. One change, too, from the Catholic Church is he says no to celibacy. So the Catholic Church, even today, priests and church leaders are not supposed to be married. So basically, if you are a priest, you are giving up on any sort of romantic interest with the other sex. With people in general. I mean, you can't do it with same sex either. And if you become a nun too, those apply there as well. Now, transitioning into Calvin, basically he's influenced by the ideas of Luther, but Calvin also thinks that God is basically providing him with some inner guidance. It becomes very dangerous for Calvin, who is originally from France, because basically those people who were not Catholic within France at that time were being persecuted, so he has to leave. Let's talk a little bit about Calvin's ideas. Basically, he is along with Luther, where he believes that justification through faith alone is what has to happen to enter heaven. But there is some differences here. Calvin comes up with this idea of predestination. Basically, you're given kind of like a lottery ticket before you are born. You basically either have the lottery ticket that gets you into heaven, or you have the one, or if you don't, you're just not going to make it. It's basically like, no hard feelings. You just didn't get selected. And so this kind of comes up with this idea of free will is supposed to exist. And so if free will is supposed to exist, if I can do whatever I want, then how could I get into heaven? So Calvin kind of comes up with this idea that you don't actually have free will, that basically God's will is the one that endures overall. Because if you were allowed to do your own things, then you would be able to do things that would make you not be getting into heaven, which would kind of throw his whole predestination idea out. There's supposed to be 3 tests, according to Calvin, that kind of figures out whether or not you're going to get into heaven. One's an open profession of faith. You're supposed to live a decent and godly life, whatever that means, right? And participate in baptism and communion. Now, the problem with these is that even according to Calvin, there's no real answer as to whether you're part of the electorate or not. If you get into heaven, you're the electorate. If you're not, I think it's called you're the probate. And so basically, it's just a crapshoot. You're not going to know whether you're part of the elect or not until you die. Even if you live the best life you possibly ever could and try to be as perfect as you could, if you're not part of this select group of people, you're out of luck. Now, the other thing, too, that he likes to mention is that just because you have material wealth and success, that does not mean that you have God's favor and are part of the chosen ones that get into heaven. Okay? As far as his church construction, he creates a church with a governing body that consists of clergy and laymen. He has a special group of people that are basically put in place that enforce the moral code and are in charge of disciplinary actions. You could have punishments be laid down upon you by the church. Anything more serious could be passed off to the local town government, where you could be whipped or banished. So, kind of some serious offenses going on within the church if you end up violating them. As far as what Calvin's church looks, we're basically rounding it out here. If you see a plain-looking church, I found some pictures of some current-looking Calvin churches, and then there's the one obviously on here that has a drawing. It's very plain. You'll see things with whitewashed walls. Basically, the focus needs to be on God entirely. And, if you look at a Catholic church at these times, you'd have pretty stained glass windows. It'd be very decorative, wood carvings and things of that nature, things that we saw back when we looked at churches in the Renaissance era. But you don't have that here with a Calvin church. Again, it's very plain. Other things, too, is you can sometimes see, my cat is meowing like crazy at the door. If it's not a kid, it's our cat interrupting these things, right? Oftentimes you can tell basically tell a Calvinist by how they dress. They're very plain. Like if you look at a Pilgrim, they were Calvinist, very plain, not flashy looking. So that's going to wrap it up for us, and so hopefully you've got a good understanding at this point of Christian humanism, Luther, and basically what went on in his life, and what happens as far as Calvinism.